Captain Jackson Cruz was a battle-hardened soldier, his reputation known across the galaxy for surviving the most dangerous of missions. He had seen it all: alien wars, ruthless criminals, and the cold emptiness of space. But nothing could prepare him for the strange, unsettling deal he was about to make on the edge of a forgotten space station, deep in the heart of the galaxy's underworld. The space station was a rusted wreck, abandoned by most, only frequented by smugglers, thieves, and the desperate. The air inside was thick, a mixture of stale oxygen and the faint smell of burning metal. Jackson stood in front of a shady merchant, his face hidden in the shadows, a figure whose reputation matched the station's grim atmosphere. The merchant had promised Jackson something that could help him retire from the mercenary life, a bounty unlike any other. But when the merchant led him into a dark, cold room, Jackson didn't expect what he saw next. A woman, shackled and bruised, stood in front of him. She wasn't an ordinary prisoner or a simple slave. She was Zora, a beautiful alien with delicate features and glowing skin, yet her eyes were lifeless, as if she had been through more pain than any creature should endure. Her once proud posture was now slumped, defeated. The merchant explained, "This is your payment, Captain Cruz. Zara, a slave from the lost Scarathian Empire, a rare treasure if you know how to use her." Jackson didn't understand what the merchant meant, but he wasn't interested. He had learned long ago to trust nothing in this part of the galaxy except for his instincts, and right now, his instincts told him that there was something off about this deal. Jackson nodded, his mind already thinking about how quickly he could sell Zara off to the highest bidder at the nearest slave auction. He could get a good price for her. He knew that much. He didn't care about her story. She was just another piece in the game, another pawn for him to use in the dangerous life he led. He motioned for her to follow him, not sparing her a second glance as he turned to leave the room. But as soon as they stepped outside, things began to shift. A sudden, piercing alarm sounded throughout the station, and the lights flickered before going out completely. Jackson's hand instinctively went to his blaster, his senses heightening. Something wasn't right. The merchant's face turned pale, and before he could speak, a voice crackled over the comms. "Captain Cruz, this station is under attack. We have pirates incoming. Everyone, brace yourselves." Jackson didn't need to be told twice. He pushed Zara toward the nearest escape pod, her eyes wide with fear, but her body surprisingly still. There was no time for questions or explanations. The pirates were closing in fast. Jackson's ship was the only way out, and if he didn't get there quickly, they would both be dead. As they made their way down the narrow corridors of the station, Zora's movements were strangely fluid, her eyes scanning every corner. She was more alert than he had given her credit for, her calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the panic around them. Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease growing in his gut. There was something about her, something he couldn't put his finger on, but he pushed it aside. He had bigger problems to deal with. When they finally reached the escape pod, Jackson strapped himself in quickly, motioning for Zara to sit beside him. The pod shot out into the black void of space, its engines roaring to life as they raced toward his ship. But before they could even get far enough to feel safe, the station exploded behind them, a shockwave rattling the pod. Jackson cursed under his breath, checking the sensors. Pirates were on their tail. "We're not safe yet," he muttered, but to his surprise, Zara remained calm, almost too calm. He looked at her, about to say something, but before he could, she spoke. "I can help you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know what they're planning. I know their tactics." Jackson stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Zora's eyes flickered for a brief moment. There was something there, a flash of intelligence he hadn't noticed before. "I'm not just a slave," she continued. "I'm more than that. And they're going to come for me. I can protect you. I can protect both of us." Before Jackson could respond, an alarm blared. The pirates had found them. Without warning, Zara stood up, her movements so quick that Jackson barely had time to react. She tapped a hidden button on the pod's console, and suddenly everything went quiet. The pod vanished from the pirate's sensors, cloaked by an ancient technology. Zara had activated something, a device hidden within her, a remnant of the Scarathian Empire. She hadn't just been a slave. She had been carrying the key to unimaginable power all along. Jackson's heart raced. He stared at her, his mouth dry. "What are you?" Zara didn't answer. She simply turned her attention to the controls, guiding the pod through the dark, hostile space ahead. Jackson felt a mix of awe and fear rising within him. He had no idea who this woman really was, but one thing was clear: Zara was far more than just a slave. She was a treasure, and the galaxy's most dangerous forces were hunting her. And now so was he. As they sped through the stars, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. But whether that change was for the better or worse, he didn't know yet. All he knew was that he couldn't let Zara go. Not now. Not ever. The darkness of space stretched before them, but something far more dangerous was lurking just behind them, waiting to catch up. The days after the escape from the pirate ambush were tense. Jackson Cruz couldn't shake the feeling that something about Zara was different from any prisoner he had ever encountered. She was more than just a slave. As they traveled through the endless expanse of space, Zara remained quiet, but there was a quiet intensity to her, a presence that made Jackson uneasy, yet strangely captivated. The first few hours after they left the pirate station were spent in silence, with Jackson focused on evading any potential threats, and Zara sitting in the corner, her eyes fixed on the stars outside the ship's windows. Her silence was unnerving, and Jackson found himself wondering about her past. Who was she really? What did the merchant mean by a treasure? And why had she been sold as a slave? Finally, after a few days of silence, Zara spoke. "I owe you an explanation, Captain," she said, her voice calm but filled with an unsettling depth. "I am not just any slave." Jackson looked up from his console, raising an eyebrow. "Then what are you?" "Because I've got to admit, this isn't the typical slave I've ever seen." Zara's eyes flickered, almost as if she was debating whether to trust him. After a moment, she stood up, her movements fluid and graceful. She walked toward the ship's control panel, pressing a few buttons. The lights inside the ship dimmed slightly, and a hologram flickered to life. It showed an ancient alien city, massive, majestic, and unlike anything Jackson had ever seen. "This is the city of my people, Captain," Zara began. "I am Ziralanth, the last surviving heir of the Scarathians, a race that once ruled vast stretches of this galaxy." Jackson listened intently, though he had no idea what she was talking about. He knew little about galactic history outside of his soldier duties, but something about her words felt important. "The Scarathians," Zora continued, "were known for our knowledge, our technology, and our power. We had the ability to manipulate the very fabric of space, to control advanced AI and robotics, and to shape entire worlds with our will. We were untouchable." She paused for a moment, her eyes filled with something Jackson couldn't quite identify. But that was before the betrayal, before the rival Varelian Empire destroyed us. Jackson shifted in his seat. "The Varelians? I've heard of them. Warriors, merciless." Zara nodded, her face hardening. "They were more than just warriors. They were traitors. They infiltrated our cities, sabotaged our defenses, and slowly dismantled everything my people built. They killed my family, my father, and my people. The few survivors, like me, were scattered across the galaxy, hiding from those who would use our technology for evil." Jackson stared at her, trying to process everything. An ancient alien empire, destroyed by a treacherous race. He could barely wrap his head around it. But something in her voice told him this wasn't just some fantasy. She spoke with a conviction that made her words feel real. "So why were you sold as a slave?" Jackson asked, his curiosity getting the best of him. Why would someone like you end up in the hands of a merchant? Zora looked away, her gaze distant. After the fall of my people, I was captured by the Varelians. They knew I was the last of the Scarathians. They needed me to unlock the secrets hidden in the ruins of my ancestors. But I managed to escape. For years, I was hunted, traded like an object, a prize to the highest bidder, until the merchant found me. Jackson could see the pain in her eyes, the memories of loss and betrayal that haunted her. He didn't know what to say. This wasn't the life of a typical slave, or even a prisoner. Zara had been part of something much bigger, something that, if it were to fall into the wrong hands, could threaten the entire galaxy. What about this treasure the merchant was talking about? Jackson asked, his voice soft. What did he mean by that? Zara's gaze sharpened. The Scarathians left behind powerful artifacts, including technology that could reshape entire worlds. I am the key to finding those relics. My bloodline holds the secrets of my people's greatest inventions, and the Varelians aren't the only ones hunting me. There are others, even worse than the Varelians, who would stop at nothing to use my knowledge for their own gain. Jackson was beginning to understand. Zara wasn't just some helpless alien woman. She was a walking, breathing weapon, a living bridge to an ancient, forgotten power. If she could unlock the secrets of her people's technology, whoever controlled her would have the power to dominate the galaxy. So the pirates, they weren't just after you because you were a slave. They were after you because of what you carry inside, Jackson said slowly, piecing everything together. Zara nodded. Exactly. I carry the last traces of the Scarathian legacy, the map to their most dangerous weapon. And if the wrong people find me, it won't just be me they'll destroy. It will be everything. Jackson felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was the key to a power that could change everything. He had known from the beginning that accepting Zara as payment in exchange for a debt would lead him into dangerous territory. But he never imagined it would come to this. What now? Jackson asked. What do we do with this information? If the Varelians and others are hunting you, there's no place safe for you. Zara's face hardened with resolve. I don't need to hide anymore. It's time to find the rest of my people's secrets. Time to reclaim what was stolen. And with your help, Captain Cruz, we'll take down the ones who destroyed my race. I have nothing left to lose. Jackson studied her for a moment. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a simple mission to get rich or to retire from the mercenary life. Zara's quest was going to bring them into direct conflict with some of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. But Jackson wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. He had already made a choice. He would help her. Whether for redemption, for survival, or something more, he wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. The road ahead would be filled with danger, and the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced. He nodded. All right, let's get to work, Zara. Let's find your people's secrets and take down anyone who stands in our way. The journey was just beginning. The quiet hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that filled the cockpit as Captain Jackson Cruz and Zara sped through the vast emptiness of space. As the ship glided past distant stars, the weight of their mission settled heavily on Jackson's shoulders. He was no longer just a soldier or a mercenary. He was now part of something much bigger, something dangerous, and every choice he made would have consequences. Zara had told him everything about her people, the Scarathians, and the terrifying power they once held. She wasn't just the last of her kind. She was the key to unlocking the hidden treasure of untold power. And Jackson had unwittingly become her protector. You understand what's at stake, don't you? Zara asked quietly, breaking the silence. She was sitting across from him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim cockpit light. There was a calmness to her voice, but it was a calmness that spoke of deep fear. Fear of what would happen if the wrong people found her. Jackson nodded, his fingers tapping nervously on the console. Yeah, I get it. If we don't move fast, the wrong people will come for you. And us. But why now? Why haven't you come forward before? Zora's expression hardened, her gaze turning to the stars outside. Because for years I was a slave. And before that, I was a princess, a symbol of hope for my people. But I watched everything I loved burn to the ground. The Varelians, they took everything from me. For so long, I was just running, hiding. I didn't know who I could trust, and I certainly didn't know how to fight back. She looked back at Jackson, her eyes filled with determination. But now I'm ready. I won't be running anymore. I need you, Captain, to help me find the remnants of the Scarathian Empire's power. We need to strike first. Before they do. Jackson sat back, processing her words. He had never imagined he'd be part of something so high stakes, so far beyond the simple bounties and mercenary jobs he was used to. He had always been a lone wolf, working for money, for survival. But this was different. We'll need to find the first artifact, Zara said, breaking his thoughts. The Scarathians left clues hidden in the most dangerous parts of the galaxy, places no one dares to go. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast. But I believe it's the only way to win this war. Jackson wasn't sure how he felt about her plan. The Scarathian artifacts were said to be powerful enough to reshape entire worlds, capable of devastating destruction or granting unimaginable power. If they were to fall into the wrong hands, they could spell the end of everything Jackson had ever known. On the other hand, if Zara was right, and they could control these artifacts, they might just be able to stop the Varelians and their dark empire for good. We've got no choice, then, Jackson said, his voice determined. I'm with you. But we'll need to move fast. If we're really dealing with something as powerful as you say, I'm sure we're not the only ones looking for it. Zara nodded. I've already been hunted for years. The Varelians will send more ships, and so will others. There are those in the galaxy who want this power for themselves. Jackson didn't like the sound of that. The more he learned about the Scarathians and their technology, the more he realized that they were dealing with forces beyond their control. But his instincts told him that Zara was the key to everything. If she could unlock the secrets of her people's power, they could fight back. They could have a fighting chance. The next few days were spent charting a course through uncharted space. Zara guided Jackson to distant planets and moons, places no one had heard of in years, where ancient Scarathian temples and ruins still lay hidden. The deeper they traveled into these forgotten parts of the galaxy, the more dangerous it became. The planets they visited were often surrounded by fierce storms, treacherous terrain, and mysterious enemies. Zara's knowledge of her people's technology proved invaluable as they used old maps and clues hidden in ancient texts to uncover long-forgotten locations. But every time they approached one of these ruins, they found signs of something more sinister. Other ships, pirate factions, and shadowy forces were already on their tail. The deeper they went, the closer they came to something much bigger than the Scarathians' technology. It was as though the galaxy was waking up to the power that Zara carried. One night, as they landed on a dark, cold moon, Zara's voice broke the silence once again. This is it, the location of the first artifact. The Cryo Stone. It's said to be able to freeze entire planets in time. A weapon of unimaginable power. Jackson looked out the window, his breath catching as the bleak landscape outside loomed large. The artifact was buried in the ruins of an ancient city, now covered in ice and snow. But something felt off. There was an eerie quiet in the air, a sense that they were not alone. This isn't going to be easy, is it? Jackson asked, his voice low as he began preparing his gear. Zara's eyes narrowed. No. The Cryo Stone has been guarded for centuries by the Varelians. They've placed powerful traps around it, and even more dangerous forces are drawn to its power. Jackson glanced at her, feeling the weight of her words. It was becoming clear that they weren't just dealing with artifacts. They were dealing with entire legacies, forces of immense power, capable of changing the fate of the galaxy. But as they prepared to enter the ruins, Jackson couldn't help but feel that they were walking into a trap. The pieces were slowly falling into place. Zara wasn't just an ally. She was a treasure, a beacon that attracted every dark force in the galaxy. And every step they took brought them closer to the heart of a deadly game. A game where the stakes were life and death. The icy wind howled as Jackson Cruz and Zara stepped out of the ship and onto the frozen surface of the moon. The terrain stretched out before them in all directions, desolate, barren, and covered in layers of thick snow. The air was thin, and every breath felt like it cut through Jackson's chest. He glanced at Zara, who, despite the harsh environment, seemed completely at ease. "We're close," Zara said, her voice steady as always. "The Cryo Stone is somewhere within those ruins." Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The ancient city wasn't far off, its ruins barely visible against the snowstorm that had picked up over the past few hours. But there was something else, something in the air that made Jackson's instincts scream. They were being watched. "Stay alert," Jackson muttered under his breath. "We're not alone here." Zara's gaze sharpened as she scanned the landscape. "I feel it too. The Varelians are already here, and I'm certain others have followed us." Jackson gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on his rifle. He had been in countless firefights before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about something much larger. The Cryo Stone, the first of the Scarathian artifacts, had the potential to shift the balance of power in the galaxy, and they weren't the only ones who knew it. As they made their way toward the ruins, the storm grew fiercer, swirling around them in thick, white gusts. The city's architecture was barely visible through the snow, towering spires of alien design that looked ancient and weathered. Jagged pieces of stone jutted out like the bones of some long-dead creature, and the silence that hung over the place was unnerving. There was no sign of life. At least, not yet. They reached the entrance of the city, a massive stone archway that stood like a guardian, welcoming them into the heart of the storm. The closer they got, the more Jackson could feel the tension rising in the air. It was as if something was waiting for them, something old and powerful that had been hidden for centuries. Zara moved ahead, her steps quiet but purposeful. "This is it," Zara said softly, stopping in front of a large stone door. The markings on it were unlike anything Jackson had ever seen, alien symbols that seemed to shift and move under his gaze. She placed her hand on the door, and to Jackson's surprise, it began to open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading deep into the heart of the ruins. As they entered, the temperature dropped even further, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. The walls of the passage were covered in strange hieroglyphs and carvings, depicting the rise and fall of a mighty empire. There was a heavy feeling in the air, as though the very walls of the ruins were watching them. They made their way deeper into the ruins, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The storm outside seemed to fade as they ventured further into the cold, the walls of the city providing some shelter from the howling winds. Jackson's eyes were constantly moving, scanning every corner, every shadow. Something wasn't right. The silence was too heavy, too oppressive. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. A low rumble echoed through the ruins, growing louder with each passing second. Jackson whipped around, his pulse racing. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his hand reaching for his weapon. Zara's eyes were wide with fear. "It's a trap," she said, her voice trembling. "They've activated the defenses. The Varelians have found us." Before Jackson could respond, the walls around them began to glow, and the air was filled with a high-pitched whine. From the darkness ahead, the sound of mechanical footsteps grew louder. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision. And then, from the darkness, they came, Varelian soldiers, their sleek black armor reflecting the dim light of the ruins. "Stay close," Jackson shouted, grabbing Zora's arm and pulling her behind him. The Varelians didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their movements were precise, calculated, an unstoppable force. Jackson's heart pounded as he prepared to fight, but he knew they were outnumbered. And worse, the ruins were full of traps, each corner and hallway designed to keep intruders away from the heart of the city. Without warning, the Varelians opened fire. Laser bolts streaked through the air, narrowly missing Jackson as he dove for cover behind a broken column. Zara followed close behind, pulling her blaster from her side and returning fire. The sound of gunfire filled the air, but it wasn't just the Varelians they had to worry about. The walls around them began to glow brighter, and in the distance, Jackson could hear the unmistakable sound of a larger machine powering up. "They've activated the central defense system," Zara shouted, her voice full of urgency. "We need to get to the Cryo Stone before the entire city is locked down." Jackson didn't need any more encouragement. He bolted from his cover, moving swiftly through the ruins, dodging blasts, and returning fire whenever he had a clear shot. Zara kept close behind, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any new threats. They didn't have much time before the entire city would be sealed off, trapping them inside with the Varelians. The deeper they went, the more intense the fighting became. Every hallway was a gauntlet, filled with both Varelian soldiers and the dangerous traps designed to protect the Cryo Stone. Jackson's heart was pounding and sweat beaded on his forehead, but he pushed forward. They had no choice but to press on. They reached the central chamber just as the ground shook again, and the door to the room began to close. Zara sprinted ahead, her hand outstretched as she reached for the control panel next to the entrance. But before she could activate it, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Jackson spun around, his rifle raised. A massive Varelian war machine, an enormous mechanical behemoth, was charging toward them, its weapons aimed directly at Zara. "Get down," Jackson shouted, shoving Zara to the ground as the first blast hit the wall next to them, sending debris flying. He returned fire, but the war machine was heavily armored and barely flinched. In that moment, Jackson realized they weren't just fighting for the Cryo Stone anymore. They were fighting for their lives. And in the heart of the storm, with the Varelians closing in and the city's defenses rising around them, they had no choice but to go forward. If they didn't, they would be buried under the weight of the past, their hope for victory smothered by the dark forces that sought to control the power of the Cryo Stone. But they had no choice. The storm had found them, and they had to face it head-on. The air inside the central chamber was thick with tension. Jackson Cruz crouched behind a shattered pillar, his breath coming in short bursts as he watched the massive Varelian war machine slowly advance toward them. The machine's glowing red eyes scanned the room, its powerful guns tracking every movement. It was only a matter of time before it found them. He glanced over at Zara, who was crouched beside him, her face set in determination. "This isn't good," Jackson muttered, his rifle raised but useless against the war machine's thick armor. "We have to reach the Cryo Stone," Zara said, her voice steady, but there was fear in her eyes. "It's the only way we can stop them from taking control of everything." Jackson nodded, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had come so far, fought so many battles, and yet they were still on the verge of losing everything. The Cryo Stone was the key to defeating the Varelians and their empire of darkness, but it seemed as though fate was determined to stop them. The war machine's massive guns were charging, ready to fire. Without warning, the Varelian war machine fired, sending a blast of energy crashing into the pillar Jackson had been hiding behind. The impact sent him flying backward, his body slamming into the ground hard. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything around him went dark. He groaned and pushed himself up, shaking off the dizziness. Zara was still on her feet, but she was struggling to stay focused. "We need to move," she shouted, pulling him toward the entrance to the next chamber. But before they could make it, the walls began to shift, and a loud mechanical whine filled the air. A force field dropped down around the chamber, sealing them in. "No!" Zara screamed, trying to move toward the control panel, but the machine's blasts kept coming, forcing them to stay low. We have to disable it. Jackson's mind raced. They were trapped. If they didn't disable the force field soon, they would be stuck in this chamber with no way out. The Varelians would just wait for them to make a mistake, and then they'd finish them off. We can't take them on head-to-head, Jackson said, looking around desperately for anything that might give them an advantage. The room was filled with shattered stone, ancient Scarathian tech, and broken machines, but nothing that could help them against the war machine. Zara's eyes flicked to the far corner of the room, where a small console sat partially buried under debris. She seemed to understand what Jackson was thinking immediately. Without another word, she bolted toward the console, moving with speed and precision that left Jackson stunned. He followed her, his heart pounding in his chest, but the war machine wasn't far behind. As they reached the console, Zora's fingers flew over the keys. "I can override the system, but I'll need time. Cover me," she called. Jackson didn't hesitate. He turned and faced the oncoming machine, raising his rifle once more. The first shot hit the wall next to him, sending dust and debris flying into the air. He fired back, but it was clear that the rifle's standard ammunition would do little to slow the massive war machine. He needed something bigger, something that could take it down. The console began to hum to life as Zara worked furiously. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't slow down. Come on, she muttered, almost to herself, as she tried to break through the Varelian system's security measures. Jackson could hear the machine's mechanical footsteps drawing closer, and his heart raced with every passing second. Just as the machine fired again, narrowly missing them, Zara hit a button, and the force field flickered. "Got it," she shouted, her voice triumphant. The force field began to deactivate, and Jackson immediately moved to grab Zara's arm. "Let's go," he yelled, pulling her toward the now open doorway. But before they could make it, the war machine fired one last blast, striking the ground just in front of them. The explosion knocked them both off their feet, and Jackson found himself lying on the cold floor, dazed and disoriented. For a moment, everything was spinning. He could hear Zora's voice, but it felt distant. "Jackson, get up," she screamed, her hands gripping his shoulders, shaking him. He blinked, clearing his vision, and managed to push himself to his feet. His body ached, but there was no time to stop. They had come too far to give up now. As the war machine prepared to fire once more, Jackson saw a glimmer of hope. A massive energy cannon was mounted on the wall behind the machine. If he could somehow get close enough, he could use the cannon to disable it. But it would be risky, and there was no guarantee it would work. "I'll distract it," Jackson said, looking at Zara with determination. "You get to the cannon. I'll cover you." Zara hesitated, but only for a second. "Be careful," she whispered, before she sprinted toward the energy cannon. Jackson sprinted in the opposite direction, drawing the machine's attention. It fired, missing him by inches as he dove behind a pillar for cover. The Varelian war machine's massive guns roared as they fired again, but Jackson was already moving, staying just out of its line of sight. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the war machine growing closer, and his heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had to take the shot. At the last possible moment, Jackson dove toward the energy cannon and hit the button that activated it. The massive weapon roared to life, sending a blast of energy straight into the war machine's chest. The explosion was deafening, and for a moment, everything was filled with light and smoke. When the smoke cleared, the war machine was nothing more than a smoking ruin. Jackson's legs were shaking, but he couldn't allow himself to stop. He turned to see Zara standing near the Cryo stone, a look of awe on her face as she approached it. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with disbelief. Jackson nodded, but the victory felt hollow. He had given everything to get to this point. His body, his mind, his soul. And he knew Zara had as well. But even as they stood before the Cryo stone, a sense of unease filled Jackson's chest. The price of victory was high, and the path ahead would be even more dangerous. The war was far from over, and there was still so much more to fight for. As Zara activated the Cryo Stone, its ancient power surged through the chamber, and Jackson felt the weight of the galaxy shift. The Varelians would come again, and next time they wouldn't be so easy to defeat. But for now, they had won a small victory, and that was enough to keep them moving forward. But the cost was already clear. The true price of victory would be paid in the battles to come. The air was quiet now, almost eerily still. The battle was over, but the scars of the fight were everywhere. Jackson Cruz stood at the edge of the battlefield, staring out at the ruins of the Varelian war machine. It was hard to believe that they had won, that they had managed to disable the Varelians' greatest weapon. But the truth was undeniable. The massive, menacing machine now lay in ruins, a symbol of the rebellion that had just begun. Behind him, Zara stood silently, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The Cryo Stone had activated, but now it was time to face the consequences. The ancient power it unleashed was still coursing through the chamber, lighting the room with an otherworldly glow. Zara's face was full of determination, but also a deep sadness. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. "This isn't over, is it?" Jackson asked quietly, knowing the answer before Zara spoke. "No," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. "The Varelians will regroup. They will retaliate. But this time, we have something they don't. We have the Cryo Stone, and we have each other." Jackson nodded. It was a bitter victory. He had lost too many friends along the way, including his fellow soldiers, Bonner and the others who had sacrificed their lives to make this possible. Their deaths weighed heavily on his heart, but he couldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. They had given everything for a chance at a better future, a future where the Varelian Empire didn't control everything. He owed it to them to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. As they made their way out of the ruins and into the open air, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the dust of war. The sun was setting behind them, casting an orange glow over the landscape. It was beautiful in a way that was almost heartbreaking. The beauty of a world that had been scared by conflict, yet still somehow managed to endure. Zara turned to Jackson, her eyes searching his face. "We need to gather the others, organize the survivors. We have to spread the word. The fight isn't just about us anymore. It's about every world the Varelians have conquered. We have to unite the galaxy." Jackson felt a spark of hope flicker within him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they could actually do it. They could defeat the Varelians. They could liberate the galaxy. But the road ahead was long, and there were still so many unknowns. Would the other planets rise up against the Varelians, or would they stay in fear? Would the people of the galaxy trust them, or would they see them as just another group of rebels with no hope of victory? "Let's do it," Jackson said, his voice steady. "We fight for every person who suffered under the Varelians. We fight for the future." Zara smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the hardness of her expression. "Yes, we do. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. They would face challenges that tested them in ways they hadn't yet imagined. But they had something powerful on their side now. The Cryo Stone's mysterious power, the courage of those who fought with them, and most importantly, the belief that they could make a difference. Jackson could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, but he also felt a strange sense of peace. They had made it this far. They had won. And now, they were going to make sure that their victory meant something. As they made their way back to the small settlement where the rest of the survivors had gathered, Jackson saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Captain Guerin, the leader of their small resistance group. Guerin had been with them from the beginning, and Jackson knew that he would be a crucial part of whatever came next. Guerin's eyes lit up when he saw them, and he quickly moved to greet them. "You made it," Guerin said, his voice filled with relief. "We were starting to think we'd lost you." "We're here," Zara said with a nod, her voice steady. "And we have the Cryo Stone." Huron's eyes widened, but he quickly composed himself. Then we're one step closer to taking back everything they've stolen from us. We'll need to start organizing. Get the word out to every system, every planet. This is only the beginning. Jackson glanced around at the survivors, soldiers, civilians, and others who had managed to escape the Varelian tyranny. They were tired, battered, and broken in many ways, but there was something else in their eyes. Hope. For the first time in a long time, it was a real, tangible hope. The kind of hope that could move mountains. As the night sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above them, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The universe was vast, and the fight for freedom was just beginning. The Varelians had thought they could crush humanity, but they had underestimated the strength of those who fought for what was right. Jackson didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. The price of victory was high, and the battles that lay ahead would test them all. But they had come this far together, and they would continue to fight as one. Tomorrow, they would start the next phase of their journey. The war for the galaxy wasn't over, but they had taken the first step toward winning it. And in that moment, Jackson knew that there was no force in the universe strong enough to stand in their way. Together, they would rise.